Okay, we're into the third section of this module, which is soil testing, and we're going to start out. This is probably one of the most important sections of this because we're going to give you a nice little overview of soil testing and tissue testing and how it affects the overall health of the plant or an overall philosophy. And one of the tools that can help you as a turf manager really give the plant what it needs is to know exactly what's in the plant. This is probably the most accurate test. It's a point test, so we're going to go back and grab a pen here. It's just one point in a line, but we can see if nitrogen's starting to drip to go down. The more points on that line we have, the more accurate the line will be. If we just have those two, it would go there. If we have something like that, we would be able to tell. So the more tissue, the better. And how this works is you mow the putting green, you take samples from the baskets, you send them to the lab, and they give you back results. And just for a rough estimate, bent grass, which is going to be the grass we're predominantly interested in, although you could do your fairways, and you could even do your rough if you chose to, we want between 2.4 and 8.3% nitrogen. That's a pretty high number there. If you notice, that's a higher number than Milorganite, some things people use. So this would say bent grass clipping replacement is definitely going to affect the overall nitrogen on your grass. Again, as a professional turf manager, you're going to want to err on the lower side of this, and we're going to talk about that decision in a minute when we talk about von Liebig's law. Phosphorus, quite a bit less, 0.2, a little bit more in Bermuda grass, which makes sense. Bermuda grass is growing more, creating more nodes. You're going to need a little more phosphorus to push that forward. Potassium, 0.8, so even a little bit more, and a little bit more in Bermuda, making it a little more wear tolerant, and also having that. But again, probably your main concern on tissue analysis is going to be your nitrogen, particularly because nitrogen is not going to be available from your soil test results. Phosphorus and potassium are going to be available in your soil test, and then calcium is another one that, as long as you're looking at the tissue analysis, you might want to make sure that it's there. And we're going to talk about calcium a little bit in the last lecture from this section. And then iron is always important. So less, around 100 to 500 parts per million for bent grass. So this is a nice slide for reference. I don't want you to put these numbers to memory, but if you ever get an opportunity to look at some tissue analysis, you're going to see some numbers. And oftentimes the nitrogen in the bent will be pushed into the 10% range, and you know if it's there, you're probably going to want to back off on your nitrogen. So that's your main number we're looking at from tissue analysis. So let's take a step back and give an overview of how do we get good turf? Why do we need a turf manager? Why is the grass different with us there than without us there? And one of the first things that an educated turf manager does is he can pick the proper grass species, the proper cultivar for a given location, both microclimate. Under a tree, you might use a fine fescue or a potrivialis. We're out in a fairway situation, you would want maybe a Bermuda grass or different cultivars that. And then macro, North Carolina versus Michigan versus Florida are going to require different grasses in those situations also. So small areas, under a tree, on your course, big areas, different states. Next, give it what it needs. What does the plant need? So that's what we're going through with soil testing and plant tissue testing. We're going to take an in-depth look inside the plant, inside the soil, and see what's lacking. And many of the big problems often can be solved by application of the nutrient that's necessary. And then the big one, probably the reason we all got into this industry, is for the toys. So moving the biggest, best mower obviously is going to make the best turf. Right. So we need to give the plant what it needs to grow. And probably the first thing the plant needs to grow is something we really don't think about very much. It's carbon. And carbon is in the air. It's all around us. CO2, our cars are giving it off every day. But the plant needs a way to take that carbon and make it into sugar. And it does that through photosynthesis and using light energy. So probably one of the most effective free energies is that giant fiery ball that shines down on us every day, the sun. And the plants use the sun to sequester carbon to make sugar. The next thing is hydrogen. It's going to get hydrogen from water. The plant needs water. All that syringing you do on the summer days helps the photosynthesis equation and helps sequester that carbon. Oxygen, sometimes we think the plants are making oxygen all the time. We don't need oxygen, but oxygen is going to be the terminal electron receptor for respiration. You need to know those equations for all my exams. Oxygen is very important. Without oxygen in the turfgrass system, we're going to really lose our root zone, and that is a problem that happens from overwatering and also from microorganisms competition for the limited amount of oxygen that's in the soil. Though we're never going to have an oxygen problem at the turfgrass surface. That's always an underground root problem. And then we go to the things that we most think about when we talk about soil. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are macronutrients. And then our micronutrients are calcium, magnesium, sulfur. And then the even lesser required, although iron would probably be more required in the turfgrass system. We could move iron up there if you wanted to. Manganese, zinc, copper, and cobalt. And then even less, molybdenum, boron, and chloride. So in that order, about 10 times more carbon's needed than hydrogen, about 10 times more hydrogen than oxygen, and it moves on down the list, where a lot of these nutrients, we would never see a deficiency in these in the soil unless we were growing 2 or 3 generations of a plant in a hydroponic solution that mixed them. But all of this stuff is necessary for plant growth. And this leads us to one of the very important laws, Justin von Liebig's law of the minimums. And what that says is every field contains a maximum and a minimum of nutrients. The minimum controls yield. So it's kind of like a barrel. That's why I have these barrels here. And if we've got adequate amount of phosphorus, potassium, but our nitrogen rung is only down here, and the other stuff is up like that, no matter how much water we put in that barrel, the barrel's only going to hold that much water. Everything else is going to leak out. And that's the law of the minimums. So one nutrient, usually in the turfgrass system it's nitrogen, but it can be phosphorus or potassium or something else, is going to limit growth. And yield is a term in turfgrass that you want to think about. What is yield? Sometimes in turfgrass we don't want high yield. If we had the highest yields, we would be mowing once a day or twice a day to do that. So sometimes we want to manage yield, and sometimes we can do that by using Justin von Liebig's law to regulate how much of a nutrient there is to regulate growth, to regulate yield. And here's a nice graph that shows that. So when we get a soil test back for any nutrient, it's going to come back one of 4 things. It's going to come back either deficient, and if it was deficient, we know by adding the nutrient, this is the axis here, how much nutrient there is. It's going to be sufficient, so we could get increased yield if we added a little more than sufficient, but it's probably okay, high, and then toxic. And that's where von Liebig's law falls off, because sometimes a nutrient in excess, maybe in the turfgrass system, zinc has been shown to be in excess sometimes, or even nitrogen in excess can burn the plant and decrease yield. So we want to maintain most of our nutrients in the sufficient. Sometimes we can get lower yield by maintaining 1 in the deficient, but we're going to monitor that, and I'll show you some pictures of how that works here in the next couple slides. If we limit what the competition needs, all the great golf course sites, or a lot of the great golf course sites, are links. They're sandy. Pinehurst, the Monterey Peninsula in California. In fact, there's only really one top 100 golf course that I can think of that's not on sand, and it's closed 6 months out of the year, if you think about that one for a little bit. But a lot of the great sites are low in nitrogen, low in phosphorus, and low in cation exchange capacity. What that does is it limits its effectiveness for crops, and it also limits its effectiveness for other weeds to grow. This is a site in Scotland, up in Brora, North Dornoch, and you can see the grass is purple, small, tight, shriveled up. Even in this area there are some broadleafs, so where they don't use broadleaf control, but the nitrogen level is so low that the grass outcompetes. And although this doesn't look like a wonderful putting surface, it is a great putting surface. And sometimes lower inputs can give you a much better system, more like the natural system. If we were to add nitrogen to this putting green, yes, it would be greener. We would get more yield. We'd have to mow it more, and the weeds would be easier to compete. So this is maintaining a system very sour, very low, that works in a lot of ways, particularly in a lynx native setting. So, some of the barriers to great grass. Some climates. This is a very difficult climate. We're in the transition zone. Sometimes temperatures here don't work. Sometimes the Bermuda winter kills. Sometimes the bent dies in the summer. High humidity. It's much easier to grow grass in the desert when we get low nighttime temperatures than in North Carolina where we have high nighttime temperatures. And this is the moisture in the air. So moisture also for the plant available, but we can control that. We have irrigation in most turfgrass systems where humidity gets to be a big problem. When we have trouble in Atlanta when the bent grass dies in the summer, it's 80-degree nights where we don't push the moisture out of the air to allow that gradient that allows water to move from the roots to the tips through a gradient difference. And I liken that to a heart attack. Turfgrass plant has no heart. It can't actively pump anything through its system. It has to use this passive system, which comes from a humidity difference. And you need to think about that. That's very important. Nighttime temperatures are very important for the health, particularly of bent grass. Bermuda grass has a different metabolism, different physiology that allows it to get around that, and we'll talk about that quite a bit in Turf 1. Money. Sometimes it's easy to grow grass with all the money in the world, or maybe not easy, but you can do it. You have to sod a little bit more. But sometimes you just can throw money at a problem. So I never like to judge a superintendent's effectiveness until I know his budget. Some of the best superintendents I know are the guys that get the most done with the least amount of money. Time. It takes time to grow grass. Sometimes we don't have that time. Some golf courses, Pine Needles is a good example, and Harbortown is another, that they don't have time to grow grass a lot of times. Sometimes they just have to sod major areas because of that. And then there are things that make their living eating turf. So Mr. Ivy will spend a whole class on that this summer talking about turfgrass pests, and you need to understand those, but also understand that you're going to have to manage all these barriers. All these guys are going to be in your way, and by giving the turfgrass what it needs and being as healthy as possible, it can fend off many of these things. All of these things that are barriers to great grass are cumulative, and they add up, and we call a lot of the grass-killing things their syndrome. There's not any one of these things would kill it, but a combination of all of them can do the job. So the first nutrient we're going to talk about that the plant needs is carbon. So we've got carbon in the air. Your car's putting out CO2. Your breath is putting out CO2. When we add water, we syringe to that, and we get the sun, 686 kilocalories to balance this equation. We get C6H12O6, which is sugar, fructose, and CO2. So the O2, oxygen into the air, so that we can breathe that. And it's a nice little system. It's one of the most efficient ways to make sugar. Water. We've got our water, which is our polar molecule. We're going to talk about the universal solvent, the hydrogens, the H pluses, and then we've got an OH minus, the minus over here. So it's a charged molecule. It will line up accordingly. The next one and the next one. And that works to pull compounds apart, and it works for all kinds of stuff inside the plant. The universal solvent, very important. We're going to spend a whole section talking about water in Turf 1 and in this class. and then oxygen from the air for respiration. We take our sugar that the plant made, add oxygen to that, and we're able to get energy. That's respiration. Animals do it, people do it, and plants do it. The most important place where the plants do it is right down at the root tip, and we're going to talk about that a little bit also. And that was it. Next time we're going to talk about the nitrogen system, which is next. This is 12 kind of overview slides. We're going to get pretty in-depth into nitrogen. And then in the last lecture of this section, we're going to talk about phosphorus, potassium, and the micronutrients.